Okay. Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us this morning, wherever you are. So this room doesn't have a mic for me to speak, it's just picking me up for the Zoom call. So if you can't hear, I'll try and project my voice, but I've got a bit of a cough. So if you can't hear at the back, I'm really sorry, you might have to move up a little bit, but hopefully everyone can hear. So I'm here in the room with my co-chair, Natasha, and we have Ian joining us online and a few people joining online as well. So I'll just quickly run us through the agenda for today's meeting. So it being the 10th anniversary of our DA, we thought this was a good time to reflect on some of the work of this interest group to date, because we have focused historically on policy alignment and the development of a journal policy framework. And I think having this reflection will also kind of contextualise this next piece of work that we're going to be talking about. So Natasha's going to talk us through that reflection. Then I'll give you a bit of an update on a workshop that we held back in February with some mainly publishing stakeholders, and we would love to get your input as well. And then we'll have a quick intro to the code availability group from Lauren, who is with us from FLOSS. And then I think we should have plenty of time for discussion, but having been in a few breakouts already, we always seem to get to the end and there turns out to be about 3 minutes left. So we'll try to be conscious of time and leave time for that discussion to happen. Okay, so I will hand over to Natasha. You can use the clicker or it is.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. So I'm just going to reflect on where our group had its origins and the work that we've done today to sort of set it up for Rebecca's piece here. So this all started with the Rogue Birds of a Feather session at Plenary 8, which was in Denver. And this was where I relayed the story yesterday at the plenary opening, that it was really sort of coming together of people sort of led by Ian Hasklitz to address the issue of the need to standardise journal data policies. That was really kind of the start of this, but not just journal data policies, but just policies in general. So we've made it very broad. So it's data policy standardisation and implementation, because it's not just about standardising it, it's also about implementing those policies. So we came together at a session that was not on the agenda, but had a group of us in the room together that were keen to address this issue, and the group was formed out of that. So at the time there were a lot of different types of policies. We had sort of a variety of funder policies, a variety of journal data policies, and it was a very confusing landscape for researchers. So, for example, the differences in journal data policies were, if the journal asks you for, it might have just said, please supply your data. And it's like, well, what is the definition of data? Is it the raw data? Is it, the processed data? Is it the data that's just part of this, that informed the article? What is it? There wasn't even a consensus just on that basic level. And then it was, where do you actually put this data? What format does the journal want it in? Is it going to be reviewed? Is it mandatory or optional? If it's a repository, which repository do I put it in? And it was a really confusing landscape. So that was the rationale, that while that it was actually the journal data policies that was the sort of lowest picking fruit, I guess, that we saw to tackle on the data policy standardisation group. So there has been some talk in the past about institutional data policies, but I think that's very hard to get some standardisation on. So that was not the one that we have tackled first, but it has come up. And of course the funder piece as well. So the group was formed and it built on the initial work that was carried out by JISC in the UK, that were trying to build a registry at the time. I think it's 2015, they tried to build a registry of journal data policies and discovered, in fact, that they couldn't do it because the policies were just so different that they couldn't categorise them at all, and they actually abandoned that project. So we had a co-chair then come on from JISC in the early days, and I was then working for the Australian National Data Service, and we had held some workshops with publishers about trying to do something in this journal data policies space, because from the publisher point of view, the journal data policies were down to the editors, and the editors were a lot of them were scared to introduce a policy because they thought that researchers would go elsewhere. So that was one thing. And secondly, they didn't even know what to put in a policy. And they were also scared about how much time it was going to take to introduce a policy that added on to their existing work as an editor. And as you know, editors are very busy people. So to even get them in a room to talk about it was a bit of an event. So this is where the group came from. And then we had a series of community engagement exercises to develop a framework of standard policy features and policy types. So this went on over a number of years, actually, at different plenaries and with working group meetings, with Ian in the Northern Hemisphere and me in the Southern Hemisphere. And we sort of ran some, identical meetings that enabled people around the world to participate in this. And the output was that we came up with 14 policy features and 6 policy types or tiers. And then editors could basically, anyone wanting to implement a journal policy, so generally the editors. So that's just to clarify, the publisher can have the overall commitment affair, that it's up to the journal editors and the individual journals to decide what policy type that they want. So this sort of helps them to select which of the features is most appropriate for them and whether they want to go down the mandating end of things or the recommendation end of things. And it mapped to existing policies, particularly from Springer Nature, but also from Wiley Elsevier as well. So here is an example feature. You have the definition of data repository and some guidance there about stating your journal's position on data policies and what is required there, and then a template there for the text that it can be used for the authors to guide them in what to provide if that is in your journal data policy. So we published this as in the Data Science Journal, and it also became an output of the RDA group. So it's a recommended output, not an endorsed output. Does anyone know the difference? We decided it didn't matter too much because actually we were engaging with publishers who wouldn't know the difference either between these things. But if one relates to a working group output and one relates to an interest group output. But the fact is, it's an output, and it's I think it's quite an achievement to have come out of this. So here are some impact and adoption examples. So scientific data, journal, Springer Nature and All PLOS journal policies have been updated to align with the framework and with the inclusion of a DMP feature as well. That was a bit of our discussion point at the time. Should how much a data management plan's part of the landscape here in terms of being required as, part of your journal article submission. We also had a collaboration with STM Association, particularly in their year of research data to promote standard policy adoption to their 150 member publishers. And that we've had some fantastic joint plenary sessions, or we've had STM talk at those. It's been really brilliant. So we published the output, and also there was some work done in Slovenia with scientific journals to review their policies with the framework, and that was actually supported by the RDA, and we did a plenary session on that as well in the past. I was trying to think whether it was a webinar, but it was actually a plenary session. And yeah, this all led to a collaboration with the funders interest group to explore policy alignment. So we had this project where we looked at, the funders were thinking about, how can data availability statements be of use here, and how can we kind of align some of the work, because if researchers are asked to do one thing for a journal and different thing for a funder, that can be a little bit of a confusing landscape. And some of the funders like Wellcome starting to look at the data availability statements. So how can we align these really well? And Jeremy's in the room here to probably give the best update on this. Anyway, so we decided to sort of approach this as a little project, and to compare some of the work. There was some work done by STM actually to look at this as well that has been shared in previous plenaries. So basically the outcome of that is that we had some joint discussions. We did that little piece of work looking at alignment. I think at the moment, at least it's stalled from our participation end to what is happening in that space is probably not a lot of appetite maybe from the funders to continue that discussion, but maybe Jeremy, you can give an update in the discussion or something around this. And so we've moved on to the improving the quality of data availability statements in general, which would help even if we are continuing with the funder piece, because, you know, we found that just because you have a data availability statement, that doesn't mean that you actually have access to the data or improved access to the data, and that will surprise nobody here. It's actually reflecting, you know, the culture of data available on request as the most common statement, closely followed by it's in the supplementary section of the journal. The two things we wanted to get away from by having these statements. So we've actually embarked on this piece of work to try and improve that quality and make data available in a repository as the most common statement. That's really what we would really like to be able to do. So there's been a few articles published that look at this. So I've just got a couple quoted there if anyone wants to look at this in more detail, but it has been proven beyond doubt, and particularly Rebecca and Ian have done a fair bit of work on this, and they've also they've published a bit on this, and one of them was looking at the median and average editor time to add a data availability to the journal as well. So yeah, I will leave it there because Rebecca is going to take us through that whole landscape. Thank you. Should I just pause there and see if there's any questions or anything Jeremy wants to add on? Yeah.
I mean, I can speak to the data availability statement work that we've been doing with this group, but that might come up. I don't know if Ian's going to be talking about it at all, or
no.
Oh, I see. Okay, or I can leave it to the discussion.
Yeah, okay, leave it to the discussion. Yeah, that sounds good. Any other questions, comments? No, then I will hand to you.
Thanks, Natasha. So we do have a couple of seats right up at the front, if anyone wants to sit. No pressure. Okay, so just so we're all on the same page about what we mean by data availability statements, because I'm not sure we're all kind of coming from the same background here. You would have seen on the chart that Natasha showed, across all of the policies available to a publisher in our policy framework, one of the kind of consistent requirements was either the recommendation or the mandate for a data availability statement. So usually this would take the form of a short section at the end of an author's manuscript. Generally speaking, it's pretty open in terms of what goes in there. So there's an expectation that the author will explain what the data set is, where it can be found, if it's not online, how can you access it as an alternative. And we're going to be looking at how these generally tend to be written by authors. So while there is some guidance available to authors, usually from the publisher that they're publishing with, we've definitely seen some common trends in terms of phrasing, in terms of the amount of information being provided. So I'm sure many of you will have already seen examples of data availability statements in articles. You won't see them in every article. It's not necessarily the policy on every journal yet. So just to kind of come back to like where we are now, I don't think we can take credit for the increase in journal data policies. Like I think we've seen some great examples of publishers implementing the framework that came from the RDA. I think things were kind of going in this way anyway. So we were already seeing journal publishers implement data policies across their journals. Many of them were introducing recommended or mandatory data availability statements. And this is a snapshot that I think Ian took maybe 6 months ago, if not longer, so I'm sure it's increased, but we can see from PubMed Central, there's around 1.5 million articles available that do have a data availability statement. So it's increasing, it's becoming more common, depending on where you're publishing. Many bigger publishers, you will see a DAS now. But as Natasha already alluded to, that doesn't mean that the data is particularly becoming more available. So I think there's an implication when you have a data availability statement that even if the data is not in a repository, you are committing that the data will be shared. And we do have quite a bit of evidence that when people say, I will share the data on request, that actually doesn't happen and it becomes less likely over time. So on the slide, we have an analysis of around 6,000 Wellcome funded research articles. And you can see while there's a reasonable proportion in a repository, there's still a large number being stored in supplementary files somewhere on the internet. So that could be a lab website, for example. People tend to say the data is in the paper, and I'm never quite sure what that means. Not public. And then upon request is also pretty common. NA, again, quite common.
Like supplementary material, perhaps?
So supplementary files, they do tend to call out separately. So you'll see people say it's in supplementary files, and then you'll navigate and you'll find that everything's made into PDF. But people also say it's in the paper, and I think they tend to mean I've got a figure or I've got a table.
Yeah,
So very unhelpful if you want to share data properly. So yeah, DAS are increasing, but the kind of quality of data sharing is not particularly. This is another study. So this is one that Ian was co-author on. It was published in 2021. So this was looking at DAS types in from different publishers. So on the slide we have BMC and we have PLOS. So you can see kind of the DAS increases when there's a mandatory DAS policy introduced. But so you can see on the slide, it's probably tiny for you, I'm sorry. So the blue chart is BMC, and you can see the red arrow is pointing to on request, which is still a large proportion of how these authors are sharing their data. And then the red side is PLOS, and that is showing the largest proportion are still in the paper or as supplementary files. So even though the DAS are mandatory and we have a lot of DAS, the data are being shared in suboptimal ways. And I would say we can broaden our discussion out a bit to think about how do we encourage better behavior? How do we stop authors from putting data into supplementary files? But I think as an interim, what we were actually thinking about in the workshop we held in February was, okay, if authors are going to do this, could they at least not do a terrible job of like writing the DAS? Like, could you at least properly tell us what this is and where exactly we're going to find it? So as I said, it's not that there's no standards. It's not that we're setting authors loose to write this stuff and we've given them no guidance. There's also guidance available for publishers. I've kind of slimmed this deck down a little bit because there's quite a lot we wanted to get through, but I had some examples of publisher templates. They all tend to look really similar. So I know Taylor and Francis have some, Springer and Nature have some, I think Elsevier has some as well. They tend to look quite similar. So you'll see if you share data in a repository, write your DAS in this way and it will give you little blanks to fill in. So most authors, although I don't know that they always read the author instructions, will have access to an example of what this could potentially look like. For publishers, we also have JATS, which is an XML encoding schema for journal articles. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. But if you are a publisher encoding your article to publish it on the web, you can actually tag parts of the article as being a DAS. And within that DAS, you can tag things as being like a link or an author email address. So you can actually get quite granular in terms of creating something machine readable, although it's not perfect. And we can talk a bit more about that. And then also in 2018, there was a piece of work done by the Belmont Forum looking at kind of something similar. So looking at the quality of DAS and what they should include. And it's very helpful. So I've got a link in the slide. We'll put it in the chat as well, maybe. But it's only looking at data in data repositories. So if you are an author who hasn't used a data repository, that guidance is not going to help you. So just to say, like, there's other work happening. Like, we're not the first people who've thought about doing this, but we did think maybe there are some gaps. So why were we talking about this in the first place? Like, I think from like the perspective of our group and our co-chairs, we just have an interest in increasing kind of the purpose and the quality of what publishers are doing, because to bring in a new data policy, to train up your editorial team, to enforce a change is really time consuming. And I think we would all prefer that we were using that time to create something useful, that the output of this is actually usable by someone who wants to access the data. And we can see that DAS are increasing, so that's great. But we also know that those suboptimal DAS are still the most common, and that, like, aside from just the data sharing not being great, the way they're written just makes them unusable. You can't machine read a load of DAS that say data available on request. It's not going to tell you anything. And already alluded to, like, we had been talking a bit to the funder interest group as well about, like, what does it mean for funders to not have access to this data? Because I think when you come to publish a research article and you make your DAS public and you explain where the data's gone, that can often be the best way for another stakeholder like a funder to track what you've done. So maybe in your data management plan, you've promised, I'm going to put my data set into an open repository, but you might never report back to the funder to say, this is where it went. And I think if we had machine readable DAS and funders could harvest that data, that would be extremely useful. So knowing at least broad trends in terms of what grantees are doing with the data sets. And for example, I work at F1000, we have funder partners who have journals with us. So partners like Welcome might be very interested to know, okay, this proportion of the data went into a repository, this is the repositories your grantees seem to be using, and so on, but we can't currently do that. So, this was actually a piece of work that we intended to do at the last plenary. So we had a fully kind of remote session at P19. None of the co-chairs were in Seoul, unfortunately. So we had this kind of contextual discussion around what could be better if we improved DAS quality. And I had a lovely exercise for us all to do where we would have worked through some examples. And like, as always, we completely ran out of time, didn't run that session, but we did promise that we'd come back and do it again with people who were interested. So if you're a member of the policy standardization and implementation group, you will have received an invitation from our list saying, we're going to hold this workshop. If you're a stakeholder in this area and you want to attend, please do. We also invited some of our contacts from other publishers. So we wanted to kind of work through some of this with a group that was mainly publishers, although others were welcome to join, and then have something to bring to this plenary to say, this is what we're thinking. Like, what do you think? What's your feedback? So we held that workshop on the 23rd of February. We ended up with 20 participants and we had more than 10 academic publishers represented. We also had a couple of other stakeholders. So we had some researchers who were kind of researching like into bibliometrics, so like looking at the information provided in DAS, kind of looking at the current quality of DAS. And we were looking, I suppose, firstly, to think about what are the issues here. Like, I think within the co-chairs group, we perceived quite a few quality issues with DAS, but we wanted to test, you know, is this what the community's thinking? Are other publishers thinking it's fine, or do they also see a problem? And then also to start thinking about solutions. So what could we, as a group of mainly publishers, commit to doing differently? What could change researchers' practice here? So we do have a draft report available. I think it's been added to the Zoom. I tried to make it like a friendly URL for you to type in if you need to type it in. So it's tinyurl.com/DAS report draft. But I think the slides get shared after the plenary. We'll try and make sure that you all have this. We'll send it out on the list again, actually. So we have a report available from that workshop that we held, but I'm going to quickly run through some of our discussion points and some of our findings. And I think if you had anything you wanted to add, if you see gaps, if you disagree, then this is the space for that to happen. But I think we'd also like to continue to solicit feedback, so it won't just be the people in this room who've seen it. So we started off our workshop with our publishing group, asking them, how would you rate the current quality and utility of the DAS that we're publishing? Again, I didn't want to make any assumptions. Like, to me, I was like, oh, DAS are maybe terrible, but I didn't want to, you know, maybe other people don't see such an issue with it. But you could see we have a cluster around the lower end of the scale. So where 5 is excellent, we had more than half of people voting a 2 and 30% voting a 3. So that was, I guess it was good to acknowledge that, yes, there is something going wrong here. There's something that could be improved. And when I say going wrong, I mean, we started from nothing. So, like, I think we've done an okay job, but I think we're now saying we could do better. So we had a brainstorming exercise on a lovely Miro board, and we worked through a number of different DAS types. So we were looking at these types of DAS that are really common, and then thinking about, is there anything missing? If I was a researcher and I read this, what I want more information, and then also thinking about machine readability. So if we could tag up this DAS and make it machine readable, what would need to be tagged, what would be useful information. So I'm just going to run you through what we thought might have been missing from some of these, and then talk about some of the why this is happening, like why is this a problem, and then some of the solutions. And as I said, would be great to also get this group's input on maybe what was missing from our discussion. So the first example we had was data in a repository. So this is one of the least common type of DAS. This is an example taken from F1000, where we do require all data to be in a repository. Personally, I was quite interested in kind of talking about this topic with this group, because even though our DAS are on the face of it pretty comprehensive, I actually think we could improve them still. So for example, I'd say the text is quite small for people at the back, but this DAS starts by saying, Zenodo, bone tissue engineering application on fracture healing, blah, blah, blah. So I suppose if you're a reader and you don't know that Zenodo is a repository, you might not really understand what this is trying to tell you. To me, it's not very human readable unless you're a bit of a data expert already. So we looked at this as an example, or like people can think of other example DAS that they've seen, because again, I think the stakeholders in the room would be relatively familiar with this DAS type. And we talked about what might be missing, what we might want to add if we had better guidance, maybe kind of better checks for what these DAS should include. So I've just picked out a selection of the things that came up. The first one was, which part of the study does the data set relate to, because our DAS didn't actually tell us. When you have a study that's using maybe multiple data sets, it gets more and more difficult to identify, like, what is this data set? Yeah, it's in Zenodo, but like, where did it come from? What are you talking about? And for example, that could say in the DAS which figures it relates to in the manuscript, just to help the reader to orient themselves. In our DAS example, the author hasn't told us, did they generate this data, or was it something they found and reused? And that would be important to know as well. Also, are there any access restrictions? So me as a data expert, I think in Zenodo probably not, but maybe it could be good to restate that, just to say, like, this data is fully open, this is where it is. We also had some ideas for machine readability, which I won't go into in too much depth, just because it's not really my area of expertise. So if someone's more familiar with JATs, you might be saying, oh, we already have that XML tag, but I wouldn't know. But some of the things that were suggested were, we need a distinct XML tag for a data repository name, whereas I think we currently just have URLs. Things weren't being tagged as data citations. We could tag something as maybe being generated data versus reused data. And then also things weren't being tagged as PIDs. And that is because like, I've looked at our XML and F1000 and we're not tagging any of that. So like, even though we could, we're still only tagging the DAS as a paragraph. So there's nothing machine readable in there. So that was our first example. And you might think, this is the best DAS of all. Why would you need to suggest anything? So they do get worse. So the next one is that one we already mentioned, the really confusing one. So in this case, they're saying the data are included in the article and its supplementary files, and that's available publicly. And I think in many ways, this is, I mean, it's better than sharing on request, because the author's saying it's public. If you want to access this, it's in the supplementary files. Unfortunately, it's probably in a PDF. So if you want to reuse it, you'll have a bit of work to do to extract the data again, but at least you can see it. But I think, as we've already said, it's pretty hard to know, like, where is the data? You've said it's in the article, but what are you talking about, and what is this data? Yeah, so for this one, unsurprisingly, we said, what is this data that you're talking about, and where can it be found? So please explain in detail which data set you're talking about and where in this article I should be looking for it, because I don't know. We also had some ideas for machine readability. So maybe we could start tagging that something's, for example, if supplementary files are being pushed to a data repository, could we tag that somewhere? Could we have clickable links or a PID for something in the supplementary files, which I think actually would be perpetuating the problem that people are doing the wrong thing, but maybe we could do that. And then just like more tagging around the fact that this is supplementary data that is available, because at the moment, generally speaking, it's not really tagged as anything. It's just a downloadable PDF you'll find somewhere on the landing page for the article. It's not tagged as data most of the time. That was that one. So this, I haven't seen any this bad most of the time because authors usually just won't bother writing one. But sometimes when there's a mandatory data availability statement policy, they will go to the trouble of saying they're not sharing the data. That's very helpful. So obviously in this case, we know nothing about what this data set is. So we said, please tell us what this is. Why hasn't it been shared? Will you share it? And then actually somebody added, I just pasted in the full comment. So they're saying, except in very specific ethical situations, should this have been published because it's a set of unsupported assertions, which I think is like a nice way of thinking about it, but we already know that most of the time the data isn't shared. So machine readability, actually I thought this was quite interesting. So could we track what we've called here negative statements? So if the data is not shared or we're missing information, could we tag that somewhere so we know, like we can easily see actually there's a big proportion where nothing's being shared. And also a standardized way to capture reasons for non-data availability. Again, I think that would be very useful because what you will find is that some researchers who are doing the right thing, they've got data in a repository, they can also have a second data set that they can't share for completely legitimate reasons. And we don't have a way to tag that they have a legitimate reason for doing that. And then finally, this was the one that sparked the most conversation. And I think that's because it's the most common. Like you see this all the time, and it's got my most hated phrase in it. So the findings are available from the corresponding author upon reasonable request. And you can imagine the first question is like, what's reasonable request? And when I worked on journals that had this, people used to ask us that all the time. And we were like, don't know actually, because they'd already agreed, the author had agreed they would share. So they can't really say, there's a reason that I won't. So for this one, what was missing? We want to know why it's only available on request. What does reasonable request entail? Like, do you actually have restrictions, or are you just saying, if it's going to be a load of work, or if you're too junior, I'm not really interested in going to the trouble for you? Could they provide some information that provides continuity? So in the example we saw, that person hadn't added their email address, which you do sometimes see people have a contact email address, but not always, because they might rely on just you contacting the corresponding author. Could we perhaps have a second email address in case that person moves institution or changes email address? And then also, I think just from a best practice perspective, would it be helpful in the DAS for us to prompt people to say where they're storing it? Because we know that over time, people lose access to their own data. They keep it on a USB stick in their drawer and then it's gone. So should we be prompting authors to say, okay, it's not available right now, but I'm actually storing it somewhere and I have a plan for it. So in 5 years' time, if you ask me, I know where it is. And then under machine readability, we have maybe could we tag the author's name, email address, ORCID, and then alternative email addresses. So I think that was my last example. Yeah, so I suppose if people feel strongly that we missed something, or I suppose they had other suggestions on like other things that we might provide in guidance on writing a better DAS, we would certainly take that feedback. But I'll just quickly move on to like summarize what we ended up saying in the end of our workshop, and then maybe we can have a bit of a discussion. We do have time. So why is this happening? Why are we in this situation where publishers are introducing policies, but what's being enforced isn't really necessarily helping with data availability? Why do we see these DAS that seem to be quite useless on the face of it, where like you'd really question whether in 5 years' time you actually would ever see that data? So this is what we identified when we were having this discussion, and I think a big one is resource. So that's resource and cost, both on the side of the publisher and on the side of the author. So on the publisher side, I think speaking from my own experience, if you want to enforce a really strong data policy that requires deposit of data into a repository, and also managing those exemptions, so those legitimate reasons for somebody not to share, you need quite specialist editorial staff. Like it's not something that editorial teams necessarily feel very skilled in. You wouldn't necessarily expect an editorial team to know all of the appropriate data repositories, like especially on a broad scope journal like F1000 Research. So like there's a lot of training required, there's a lot of support required to make sure that editors know what to tell the authors when these data are coming in. Natasha already alluded to the study that myself and Ian co-authored, which was looking at editorial time. So we were gathering data from Nature editors to see when we introduced stronger policies on Nature journals, what was the impact on the editor's time, and was there a different impact depending on what type of DAS was being provided. And I'm not going to recall the stats exactly, but certainly I think when it was data in a repository, the time taken to check was, I think, double the really simple DAS, which is like data on request. And that makes sense. And then also resource on the side of the authors. So if you've never shared data in a repository before and your journal's giving you a choice, they're like, you could put it in a repository, but you can say it's available on request. Why would you put it in a repository? Like, if you don't know what you're doing, you don't have time, you've just gotten into the submission system and you want to hit send, you don't want to stop, go back, prepare your data, upload it to a repository. And that is the workflow that authors tend to be using. Like, many of them won't be aware of even our strong data requirements until they're in the submission system and suddenly they're like, oh no, I didn't do anything. Secondly, like, I guess kind of touched on this already, but lack of familiarity with the requirements. So not only to share the data properly, but also to write a good DAS. Like, they're not being told anything different, so they're going to write, either use a template or write one sentence. Lack of understanding why it's important. So I think this is something, again, I personally struggle with a bit in my role, which is communicating the benefits of doing things right in a compelling way that a time-pressed researcher cares about. So I feel like there's a big, there's quite a gap between the researchers who care about open science and believe in it, and the researchers who just want to publish and nothing you say seems to really change their mind. And then lack of incentives. Again, like I think there's the many intangible benefits of like the good of science. There's a bit of research again from that study I shared that Ian had co-authored around the citation benefit of sharing data in repositories. But still, when the message is you could get more citations, I don't know if that really compels an author to do something different in the midst of a submission process. Obviously, using templates and not doing very much work is the easy route when you're an author trying to submit. So again, if you don't have to do anything differently, I'm not sure we've disincentivized the easy route yet. And then also, again, as we said at the very start, publisher policies, they're still not completely consistent, and most of them don't require data sharing in a repository. So many publishers, the bulk of the journals, the most stringent policy they'll be on is that you have to have a DAS, not that you have to have data in a repository. So those were some of the reasons that we identified that maybe we're not in the best situation with DAS right now. We also thought about some solutions, and again, would love your thoughts on this. So one was a framework, a checklist, I guess, better guidance to support quality improvement. And I think that could be both on the publisher side and the author side. So the first thing we need to do is decide what we're asking for. And I think that's what we're trying to do now. But maybe creating something from that could be guidance. Better linking of DAS to data sources. So I think this was more on the machine readability side. So if something's in a repository, tagging it. If something's in supporting information, tag it, because at least it's public. And at the moment, we don't really do that in our XML, so not machine readable. Get better at sharing, or in some cases, creating the expertise among journal staff, editors, and reviewers. Because I think, again, there's a bit of an assumption when data's in a repository, your peer reviewer will access it, and that's definitely not always the case. And then finally, not sure how to interpret this one, but making the easy options, so data available on request or supplementary files, less visible. So I think that means in the submission system that, like, we're not kind of prompting authors to do this bad practice approach, and maybe guide them a bit towards the better practice. And like, I don't actually think that would be very easy, because manuscript submission systems are very, like, they tend to be quite consistent, like across the publisher portfolio. It's not easy to change them. It's not easy to make kind of bespoke changes that would change author behavior. But I see why that's a suggestion. So I think, yeah, that was my last slide. I think we have maybe 15 minutes for discussion. So I would really welcome your feedback on this, if you had other suggestions. I might pick on a couple of people in the audience. Okay, we have some questions in the room. Oh man, there's a lot of questions. I think yourself at the back, you were first. The mic's in the middle of the room, so you just shout.
Okay, yay! Jenny Larkin, NIH. This was fantastic. We actually did a similar study about 5 years ago, leveraging PubMed Central because it had a data availability statement, so that was fantastic. We found much the same thing, so that's nice. Just a couple thoughts. First of all, I'm super excited about your focus on machine readability. This is so important. One of the things I've been thinking about is, yes, tag the repositories. The question I'm bubbling in the back of my mind for some time now is, why don't we have PIDs for the repositories themselves so it's more machine readable, please? And also tag funding for the data as well as the publication, please. Can we make that more machine readable? One of the things we found is, at first we were super excited that we had some percentage, it was low, but some percentage of publications that identified repositories and provided DOIs or PIDs for the data sets. We were super excited about that. But when we looked at those publications in more detail, they only provided those for the scientific areas where it was a best practice. So even in those, it would give the genomic repository of choice identifier or DOI or whatever. All the other data types, they often didn't even mention that data or say how it was shared, and if they did, it was in the materials or that ambiguous, it's somehow magically in the publication. So that is the one additional thing I have you think about. Just because they're citing a repository and a DOI or whatever for data in it, that doesn't mean all data underlying that publication are in fact shared in that manner. The last thing to think about, maybe on ways to make it easier, is coming from NIH, and our data management and sharing policy is now live. So going forward into the future, more and more investigators will have data management sharing plans. Is there a way to partner with DMP tool? So all of these people who already have data management plans, is there a way to partner with them to help them generate a useful DAS for their publications?
Yeah, that's something that we've been thinking about a bit at F1000 as well, but I'm not sure exactly. It's kind of a technical solution. In terms of PIDs for repositories, someone suggested that Re3 Data provides them. I'm not sure. I have to go and look. It feels crazy that there wouldn't be any.
I've been looking into it.
No?
Yeah. They might. If they do, no one's using it. Some of them use RRIDs. I looked at Re3 Data.
Pair sharing
UIs
for a repository.
Yeah, but not enough of them do that. That's wrong.
So I was, as you were speaking, I was just typing to my co-chair on Zoom to say, could you write this down? Because they're all good suggestions. Jeremy, you have your hand up?
Just unless you had more comments related to the comments.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Just with respect to the work with the funders and the funder perspective, first off, many thanks to Ian for the work he did in pulling together that meeting in May 2022. I don't know if he's listening, but I don't know if I ever appropriately thanked him for that. So that's great for him. And thanks to him for that. With respect to funder interest, I guess you have to drill down on interest, and you have to think about specific funders. So I don't think there is kind of a common understanding across funders on the value of DAS, data availability statements. I think funders generally recognize kind of their usefulness in promoting culture change and all that stuff. Not a lot of funders are actually using them to monitor compliance, like at Welcome and certainly at CIHR where I'm from. So that makes, when you're actually using them through that makes them much more, the value much more present. And so when thinking about kind of funder interest, I think funders we found are kind of like vaguely interested in better DAS. But when you start kind of raising the possibility of funders actually working to kind of improve their quality, there's a lot of that raises issues about resourcing, and then like what are funders going to require, like the use of DAS, and then that raises questions about like tracking, like, because if you're requiring, you've got to track it and all that stuff. So, but at least from the perspective of CIHR, like as we move forward to implement the FAIR principles, you know, like we're very interested in DAS and researchers using data ability statements and their, you know, and in how that can be increased in just usage in general, but also, you know, valuable data ability statements, ones that aren't like the ones that you presented on the slide. So, you know, I would certainly like encourage publishers in this group to, you know, because I would love to be able to kind of like point to like templates that researchers could consult or something like that, you know. It's just there's a lot of like kind of policy options that go beyond like requiring data ability statements, you know, like just encouraging them and all that stuff. So yeah, just a note of encouragement for this work and for this group. And then just any opportunity to kind of point towards like best practice examples to help grant holders actually use DAS. At least at CIHR, we're very, very interested in doing that.
Yeah, and I think if it was possible to pull out the machine readable data, we would have more use cases. Like we already know we can't do it, so it's hard to talk to funders about like, oh, if we could, would you like this? And I mean, I think the feedback we've gotten so far is positive. And also, like, I think, like, in response to that, I think it's unfortunate that we have authors going to the trouble of providing us a bit of information, especially the ones using repositories, and we immediately lose any value because we will never be able to pull that out of our systems again. Like, we can't do an analysis of what's being published in F1000 and where, like, which repositories are being used, even though the author has gone to the trouble of putting that information into our system. A few people had their hands up. So I think yourself was next. Yeah, it.
The microphone. Paul Richards from UK Research.
Good.
Sorry, Paul Richards from UK Research and Innovation. So we do have a requirement for a DAS in our new open access policy. We had one on our previous one, although it wasn't quite surfaced as well. Albeit one of the pieces of what we recognise we need to do is provide more guidance. So at the moment, we just point to some best practice, not just from funders, but also from research organisations in the UK who do have public guidance as well. So I guess one thing of this is thinking about where there are particular funder requirements, for example, in repositories, about how in these sort of standards publishers might signpost that authors might need to take that into account. And it's useful to hear what comes out of this and thinking about how we offer guidance as well. And then my other, I guess, observational question is, we have councils that cover a whole range of research, from medical research through to arts and humanities, and it is a blanket requirement introduced in our open access policy. So I'm wondering, in the work you've done, do you think there's differences needed for, say, medical sciences versus arts and humanities? Whether there might still be what we do understand as data, but it might be very different functionalities. Have you taken that into account?
So I would say it hasn't kind of folded into this piece of work yet, but it is my specialist subject in my own work. So I've done a lot of work in the last year around data policies for humanities and social sciences, but I think humanities were the bigger challenge. It's definitely something I'd like to acknowledge, although I think having kind of worked through this, where we were looking at how a mandatory data sharing policy applies to an arts and humanities journal, where we ended up was with maybe more considered use of terminology, but the requirements for what goes in the DAS were quite similar. And I think it also opened out what we required in our DAS for other disciplines. So thinking about what a humanities scholar might have used as the input to their research and what we'd like them to tell us about it, we started thinking about people who might have gone to a physical archive space, who might have looked at museum objects. We were like, well, you could use a physical sample if you're not a humanities scholar. So like, why don't we give that guidance to other authors too? And I think it was really helpful to take the much broader view in terms of what are we actually asking people for and why? Like what do we want them to tell us and what does the reader expect? So yeah, like I think that will really inform what we're doing here, although like it hasn't quite been captured here yet. So, thank you. Yeah, awesome. Somebody else had their hand up? Yeah, go ahead.
Where's the microphone? Oh my God! Okay, I'm from Brazil, and I wonder whether you've looked at the Cielo network of, have you, of periodicals? It's started in 97 as, it's heavily funded by a Brazilian funder, FAPES. And it actually publishes, totally open, 300 periodicals from 15 countries. Okay, I was looking at the data right now in my phone. So these are usually periodicals or journals that are published by scientific societies. Okay, so they cover a very broad spectrum, up to 12,000 papers per year and 80,000 downloads per month. Okay, so it's mostly Brazil, but now we have all Latin America, South Africa, Portugal, and Spain. And they started Cielo Data 2-3 years ago. And it would be interesting for you to find out their experience, because while some editors and journals and domains are very open to DAS, others just refuse it, either because it's not to their particular domain interest, or because it's not part of the culture of that domain. So they can share with you their experience with a range of publishers, let us say, and a range of domains.
Sure.
That's all.
Yeah, I've heard of it, but I haven't looked at it specifically.
Oh, yeah.
I might pick on one of the other publishers in the room just to talk about that experience of introducing policies where you've got this, like, journals across multiple disciplines. Shall I pick on Graham?
Yeah, sure. I might shoehorn in something else that we've done in the meantime. Yeah, I actually just wanted to make the case for data availability statements, because I think this, this piece of work that Rebecca's been presenting is really important, but all the analysis of different statement types and seeing how data sharing, what's the current state of play, where is it going, is all really powered by data availability statements. I would say that if you just try to do that off data linking, data citation necessarily, it wouldn't perhaps work as well. Part of the reason I'm saying that is that Springer Nature has just, where I work, has just announced 2 hours ago that we're actually moving to data availability statements as standard across all of our journals. And there will be a time period for us to actually implement that. We're not sort of clicking our fingers and making it the case, but Nature journals, BMC journals are already on that. Springer journals will be adopting it progressively, but that's really because, data availability statements, they provide the transparency around it. There's some feedback, I think, that they don't necessarily lead to data sharing, but I would say that's not exactly what they're set up to do. They are set up to encourage it, but data sharing, I would say, there's practice, there's policy aspects as well. And really the important thing is that transparency that it provides. We've also updated our guidance along some of the lines you mentioned. We've actually moved away from templated statements to use examples, because what we find is that we've just copied the template and put it straight in and it's meaningless. So we've listed examples by discipline, which really relates to the question, actually saying this is how you can see it in practice for your area. And yeah, we've really reached out across all the different disciplines that we've published and found actually people are broadly really positive about this. We expected, for example, humanities and social sciences to be really tricky, but they were really positive about this area. So you can just actually summarize data. I do think there are some other challenges as well, particularly in the metrics session, which happened yesterday, like how data availability statements and data citation like how they interoperate and play with each other. I think there's some big kind of questions in that. But yeah, I think I covered some of the answer to your question along with shoehorning mine in.
Yeah, so I suppose had the same experience. Like, I guess there's some initial skepticism, or maybe just not being sure of how this applies, but then generally speaking, it seems to be acceptable. I thought we might quickly turn to questions from Zoom, and also our co-chair Ian is on the call, so I wondered, did he want to add his thoughts? So Ian, if there's any questions that have come through on Zoom that you'd like to put to the room, or if you wanted to add anything, maybe you could unmute.
Hello. I have been most focused on taking good notes, so hopefully you'll see them and appreciate them in the document. There is a question from Katie McNeil, which I think is different to what's been asked so far, and that is the need to better equip editors and reviewers to review the statements. How might we improve this? Are any current initiatives doing so?
So around kind of training or upskilling for editorial teams who would be checking the DAS, is that?
Yeah,
That's what the question.
Yes, yeah. How might we empower or train editors and reviewers to engage with them? And does anyone have any experience of doing that?
Sure. So I would first say, like, I think this is what the work of the STM Association's Research Data Programme has been looking at. So kind of looking at ways to support publishers to implement these stronger policies, and they've had a big focus on data citation and data availability statements. But I think we have someone at the back who wants to, were you responding to that?
Yeah, I'm Chris Hunter from GigaScience. So GigaScience has a very open policy and we make sure that everything is available with it. And the way we do that is we actually have data curators that effectively do a data audit. It's effectively a review of the data. So we do that already, and we're working on producing some documentation to actually be able to train others to be able to do this more as an outsource rather than trying to keep it in-house, because there's only 4 of us doing the data curation. So as we grow, we're expecting to see more of this. So we need to be able to train peer reviewers to be able to do the data audit itself. So yeah, that's something we're working on.
Yeah, because I think if you think about, like, most researchers as not really having this experience, some are very good, some have never done it before. Like, the editorial teams are exactly the same. Like, this is quite new for everyone. And I think even on journals that have strong data policies, like, there's still continual upskilling to be done. Like, there's new repositories. Like, I'm constantly reviewing repository lists to see, like, do these meet our criteria? Do we need to add them? We just added guidance on RRIDs. So, like, things change quite quickly in this space, and the editorial team have other things to look at apart from data. It's just one part of their job. So totally agree. Like, if there was, I suppose the STM Research Data Programme is one thing, but if there were other initiatives around this that people want to share, great. Matt?
Yeah, I guess just to say, from the point of view of Taylor and Francis, we're a publisher which has kind of academic editors, so academics who are involved in editing the journal, trying to find reviewers, manage the flow of publications. A lot of that's not done by internal staff. So the point that Katie makes about training is relevant. We're looking at how we can have kind of administrative support for those policies. So what steps, what level of compliance with the policy can we do with administrative non-subject level experts? So, like, if there's a policy where their authors have to include a statement, that's like a yes or no. Have they done that? And that can be done by anybody. You can look at the paper. No, they haven't done a statement. Okay, you can bounce that back to the author and say, oh, you haven't included a statement. Here's the template. Here's all the guidance. Please write that. When it comes to what's in the statement, does that match the methodology of the paper? Like, that's something that administrators can't usually do, and we do need someone with a subject level expertise to be able to do that. Like, we've definitely had examples in the past where in life sciences, people were running studies on insulin in mice. They just say, oh, we've got no data for this paper. And that is a perfectly allowable data sharing, data availability statement for a review article. But actually, when you look at the methodology in there, we gave insulin to 30 mice twice a day. Like, you've got data, but you need somebody to join those things together. And that's, I think, the gap that Katie's pointing out, and we're trying to kind of build. But we're at a stage where editors are picking the policy level, and at the moment, as you say, most journals are on a very low level policy, and you're asking editors to take on more work and reviewers to take on more work and when there's a lot of other pressures and lots of other things going on at the same time. So yeah, there is a pinch point there that we're all going to have to think about.
Graham, did you want to come in, and then Stefan?
Yeah, it's similar, building on the points that have been made, for example, Matt's. One of the approaches we've had at Springer Nature is to try and take what we have in place at Springer Scientific Data, so one of the leading sort of data journals, which is quite similar to GigaScience, where we actually have curators doing a lot of very intense sort of work, applying data expertise. Moving to the rest of the portfolio, really, how can we actually apply that without having to add a certain number of data curators on every journal, which might be unsustainable, is actually putting them into more of a training role. So they're training up these kind of administrative assistants, working with tools, exploring automation, really to apply some level of data expertise and to supplement what reviewers and editors are doing, as well as applying things like integrations to actually make it easier to get data in front of reviewers in the first place. So it's really a training approach that we're taking out from just, we will do it for every single data set.
Stefan, did you want to come in?
Yes, hello. So I would like to chime in and strengthen something to not perceive the data availability statement as something tacked on at the end of it and integrated better with the rest. For example, the author contributions, because we have the corresponding author, but he or she might not know too much about particular data sets. So you would have the experts on the author list on the data set. So linking those two thingies together and mentioning that Jane user submitted the data to the GenBank thingy or something like that. And the other thing is you have the data availability statement saying the data, but then it's so much more granular than that. And you could be in the article pointing to what data is confirming a particular statement that you're making. And I would like to give the example of GitHub being able to give you a persistent identifier for each and every single line in your computer code that you have. And in the article, you could be pointing to function XYZ and say, this is doing something. Or a data sample, a sample in your biological data set shows this anomaly.
Sure. There's a lot of muttering in the room when you said that. So yeah, I think we're talking about roles. So we started to do a little bit of that, and I'm sure other publishers have too, using like credit roles. But to me, they're not still super granular in relation to like what you do with the data set. We've also had like a hypothetical conversation about like maybe the data availability statement should be the top of the article. Like maybe that's the most important thing. I don't think it will happen. So yeah, do you want to?
I know we already discussed that there's some ambiguity around like what is meant when people say data available upon reasonable request. I wonder if some of what it might mean to some, or what a reason why someone might think it's unreasonable is if you're not from the discipline that the author is from, whether they take that into account and say, well, you're not a biologist or whatever it is, so that's not reasonable. Knowing that, you know, people are much more interdisciplinary in nature and might be, you know, planning to use that data set in concert with other data sets to answer other research questions, but do they just say, well, if I don't know who you are, and if you're not in my discipline, then I'm not giving it to you.
Definitely. I think that's often it. So it's like, I don't recognize you. What are you using it for? And then the other big one I think is, oh, I actually didn't prepare it to share and now it's too time consuming. Like, I'm not going to bother. There was actually a really good paper on reasons for turning down a request. I think it was published in Science Data. So that's what the authors were looking at across disciplines. What were the reasons given when the data wasn't shared on request? And it did differ a bit by discipline. I just remember the social sciences one because one of the reasons was the person was dead. So I do want to come, there's another question in the Zoom that I thought was interesting, and then maybe one more from the room, and then we have a short talk from Lauren, and then I think we can come back and just have a quick chat about what our next steps are. So the question from the Zoom was, is there any intent to engage repositories to assist in DAS creation, since many work closely with the authors and data producers? And I would say, I don't think so, like not that I know of, but it totally makes sense now that I read it. Like, so some repositories will, for example, provide like a citation you can grab, so you can just paste that into your reference list. I haven't seen any efforts around either guidance to create a DAS or maybe providing a templated DAS, but that would be cool. I don't know if there's any repository stakeholders in the room, but that sounds very interesting to me. Did someone have a final question? And then we will have time to talk about what we're doing next. I think you had your hand up first. Sorry.
Almost a query around the question. Has anybody looked at the data use ontology, which is something the GFGH have been working on? So it's basically how data can be used list of terms, basically, it was originally sort of for human data, so what sort of consent statements are involved with it, that sort of thing. But there's no reason why the data use methodology couldn't be expanded to cover things in the
Yeah,
past.
I'm not familiar with it, but
Maybe that's something to be sort of examined.
thank you. So I think in the interest of staying on time, we should hand over to Lauren to give a quick update, and then we will come back.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me here today. I just want to present a bit of work that I've been working on with a couple of colleagues since the last RDA session, and I'm presenting it here now. My colleague Tom Honeyman is presenting it to the software source code group at the same time, and we're bringing here just really to kind of get some feedback from the group to try and work out kind of what our next steps are, and if there's a kind of an existing home in RDA for this kind of work. It could be this group, could be another group, could be a joint venture, or if we should be starting something new. So this is a kind of very lightweight sample of kind of publisher policies we've been looking at in terms of code availability, so kind of adjacent to the data side of things. And just a brief history, that the last RDA I ran a sort of a further session with Tom, and we're kind of really asking the question, like, sharing code that supports a publication, like, is it time that we start kind of looking at this and aligning goals and publisher policies around that? And there was kind of consensus in the room that actually, yeah, we should probably start looking at code that's kind of supporting publications, and publisher policies are probably a good place to start for that. You know, there's also pieces to do around research education and kind of standardized ways to share code potentially. Yeah, we thought we'd start with publisher policies because that's often where a researcher kind of first comes to the idea of sharing code. We kind of aligned our group with RESA, the Research Software Alliance Task Force, to give ourselves a bit more kind of exposure and kind of access to other networks. And we carried out a really kind of high level initial landscape analysis, trying to work out how many policies there were out there and kind of what kind of variation there might be. And after that, we decided actually we're going to do a deeper dive analysis and try and focus on publishers that have a kind of publisher-wide policy, because actually we're finding there were quite a few that had kind of journal level policies, and they're really hard to categorize. So we thought we'd take that bigger view, see what we could come up with. So the process we went through was this kind of identifying these publishers, using the chorus list of publishers as a kind of starting point. And we wanted to capture things like, how is software mentioned? So is it called code? Is it called source code, algorithm, software? There were a lot of terms that came up. We wanted to categorize whether certain features were mandated, encouraged, or not encouraged, if they're not even mentioned. And they were things like code sharing in itself, things like repositories, record preservation, features around repositories, like were they trusted repositories, was version control kind of important highlighted, various things, availability statements was code mentioned. And then we were interested in looking at things like, was code citation mentioned? And if it was, whose code was it talking about? There are, software citation principles, which are about citing other people's software. Sometimes these kind of get misinterpreted, and publisher pages will talk about code citation in terms of citing your own code in the reference list. So we're wondering whether that was clear or not. And things like, where does a policy around code sit? Is it in guidance? Is there an actual policy? And does a separate policy for code exist, separate from data, separate from, say, a piece of software that maybe is described as in a software paper? So the three of us who did the coding on code, and then we compared what our kind of categorization was. So we analysed kind of 27 different publishers, and actually it's really interesting because we only agreed on what those policies or the guidance said about a third of the time, 36%. And the three of us are people who are part of RDA. We kind of work on kind of code sharing, data sharing stuff all the time. So we have vested interest. We're all native English speakers, so there shouldn't have been any kind of confusion about how to interpret things like you should do this or the must do that. But it turns out we interpreted those kind of statements differently quite often. So if you think about, a non-native English speaker who's perhaps kind of new to open science, there's like a whole added layer of kind of interpretation that's going on there as well. And so when we found where there was disagreement, if 2 out of 3 of us at least, agreed that we took that as good enough, and in the kind of about 15% of cases where there was absolutely no agreement whatsoever, I took it upon myself to go back through all the pages and the notes that we've made and try and find what actually the kind of coding should be for that. And a lot of the time that was because one of us had found a different web page to the other person, right? You can imagine clicking through various links and then you find a piece of information that's more definitive about what an author should be doing. So that was, quite an interesting finding in itself, that actually we weren't just disagreeing about what these policies meant, we were disagreeing about where to find this information. Again, if you think about an author who's publishing in lots of different journals all the time, that's replicating that journey to try and find that information each time is quite a big ask. So the results of that kind of analysis, that we found about 52% of the publishers talked about code sharing. That's good, so at least they're mentioning it. That's a bit better than the 22% that Natasha was mentioning in her talk that mentioned data sharing several years ago. So perhaps we're at a slightly better starting point. And of those who talk about code sharing, there were some commonly mentioned features. Most of them talked about sharing in a repository. They talked about record preservation. Trusted repositories was mentioned quite a lot, as were PIDs, and data availability statements or availability statements. That they were phrased in various ways. So those were all quite common features, but they were mostly encouraged features. So we found very few publishers were mandating the use of any of these. So data availability statements were the most commonly mandated feature, again by just under a third. And again, that's in the context of code, but often they're called data availability statements. So just that kind of use of that language then is kind of almost demoting code in favor of data again. And things like showing in a repository, record preservation PIDs were only mandated about 14% of the publishers we looked at. So some of our general impressions that I've already said, that it's really difficult to agree on the coding of these policies, right? So there's tons of interpretation out there. And actually, as we were going through, we found that there are loads of complementary policy instruments that are being used, like top guidelines or FAIR principles, data citation society mandates. So, and that's great, it's really good that publishers are using existing kind of frameworks to help guide and support researchers. But again, if you're a researcher coming to different journal pages, trying to work out what to do, and you're coming up against lots of different complementary policy instruments, it's not necessarily a straightforward landscape for an author. We found that there's really little creation of separate policies for code. And what we were often finding that they were rolled into kind of data policies a lot, or it might say, this is our research data policy. Research data includes X, Y, and Z, including code, and then the rest of that policy only ever talks about data, right? So if you've read all your way through that, at the end you're just thinking about data, so things like code might slip out of your mind. So there's, I think, real potential kind of language problem around that. And then other things that there was a lot of guidance and it looked like policy, or there's a lot of policy that looked like guidance, and it was kind of sometimes hard to tell whether it was actual policy and you had to do this stuff, or whether you were just being really encouraged to do it. And again, we found things that sat on editorial policy pages, we found stuff that sat on submission guidance pages, we found stuff that sat on general kind of open science guidance pages for authors, and there was a real sense of inconsistency around how this is spoken about. That's not just for code, but data as well, right? And if you're an author, you might follow guidance, you might not, but if it's a policy, you probably think that you might actually have to do something about that as well. And again, a lot of variation in how software is described. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think what we found that different disciplines describe code in different ways, and that kind of suits their discipline, whether they call it code, source code, software, scripts, whatever it is, and that's fine. I think sometimes we have a over tendency to standardize everything, and it makes kind of my job easier if there's one description for what that is, but it doesn't necessarily resonate with those communities. So whilst I guess I started this process thinking that we just needed one kind of unifying definition of what we meant by code, actually I think now it's better just to say code and say, this is inclusive of probably all these other terms. You work out what's best for you and your community. So we were trying to think about what should we do next with this work? Where could we go with it? And we're thinking that there are a couple of potential next steps that we'd like to suggest, and we'd love to hear everyone's feedback on that. And that we could encourage publishers to review their guidelines against these complementary policy instruments to start with, right? So if you mention the top guidelines, are you considering the data and code separate? Because there are two different guidelines in top for that. If you mention the FAIR principles in the context of code, actually, perhaps you should be mentioning the work that's come out of the FAIR for RS group RDA instead, so having really code-specific guidance. If you're talking about data citation, are you mentioning software citation in the kind of way it was intended to be used? So we like to think that that's a relatively simple ask, but as someone who works for a publisher, it's not so simple to edit your pages, but at least you could review if we're referencing other policies correctly. And then we were wondering, should we start working towards a standardized code policy framework, very much like this group has done with data policies? And in which case, to what extent do we need to look at the relationship between data and code policies? Are we just merely trying to replicate the data policy framework, or do we have something that's complementary? Because I guess you have the danger of if you have two very similar frameworks, then people just adopt one and think that it covers both. How do we really differentiate between data and code policies? So it's clear to authors. Do we actually keep them together, but really make it explicit that we're talking about both data and code? How do we involve those complementary policy instruments? And is there some kind of standard guidance that perhaps RDA could create that we point to? And so these are kind of our thoughts around next steps. As I say, we'd be really interested to hear what everyone else thinks and how this kind of sits alongside the data policy work. So I'm just going to say thanks and acknowledge my co-coders, Tom and Hugh, and all the members of the task force who've been giving us feedback throughout this work. I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Will you be sharing that analysis of the publisher policy?
Yeah, I can do it. I left it a bit late, so I haven't tidied up my spreadsheet.
Oh,
yeah.
That'll be really helpful.
Yeah, we can add it to the notes for the session.
Just needs to finish coding.
Was there a question? Someone's got their hand up. Oh yeah, the top.
So I think some of your last points are really interesting about kind of where we might align initiatives around data and code and where they might need to be separate. We've just spent an hour and a bit talking about data availability statements. Can you imagine papers having a code availability statement underneath the data availability statement? Do you think we need to be talking about data and code availability statements, or data and code and software, or do we need to start calling them object availability statements? Or it's the big, when do you start adding them? Where do you stop?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point, because I found myself suggesting that, we have a data availability statement, then we should have a code one. And then I was like, and materials, okay, so we just have an outputs availability statement. But then I think the problem comes when you're looking at the machine readability of those statements, right? How do you pull apart those different kind of sentences and things are kept? So I'm not really sure what the answer to that one is.
Yeah, I've just come from the complex data citations group as well. And that they're studying in earth sciences, and they're looking at, how to cite lots of rocks and things like that, and soil samples and all kinds of things under one DOI umbrella, basically. And I think we need to plug some of their thoughts, which are taken from researcher needs and frustration, like all their use cases were from researchers or research centres trying to do this. And we're sort of taking the publisher angle, and we need to be able to connect up with some of the things that they're doing there, because it relates to, the code being plugged in as well as the data, and how we do this as a output statement or whatever.
So having one umbrella DOI and everything.
Exactly, and it's so and that feels to me, by speaking early, but we've already got this framework for data policy that took quite a long time to put together, and it feels like building on that would be a better option than you guys creating a new one. It took us years, just saying.
That's fine, but I guess then we don't want to kind of undo or muddy the waters of any hard work.
Yes, there's some thought to put in. I'm not saying that's the answer, but it feels like we should think about how to build on that.
It's happy for us to. Great.
Me, a quick remark, because I would like to draw a parallel between what was said before, that data will need a context. And when you talked about software and code, the code, the CAS, CAS would need something about the context, the compiler, a virtual machine or whatever. So where does this end in terms of reusability, let's say?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And the session before, there was a bit of a feather on computational reproducibility, right? So I think there's a lot of thoughts going on around RDA about how we align all of this. And I think that's where the umbrella DOI is really useful, right? So it can find all that information without having to put loads of it in multiple. Have a look. Scroll down. Also, someone's asking, leveraging a control vocabulary to identify the correct object be one possible strategy?
I would love if someone would create that.
Yeah, I'd love it too. I'm not really technically minded enough to know, but that'd be great. And then tagging individual statements.
So it's like a terminology issue, I think. And I think it's that not everyone will always use this. It's not that we don't. It's some people will always use a different term for the same thing, and that's not going to change.
Yeah, and then again, getting that kind of process incorporated in your journal workflows. I've learned coming from a library world to a publisher world that it's really not as simple as you think it might be.
It's a total nightmare.
There's a question at the back.
So some comments on also the comparison between the data availability and the software availability. If we have the data, then a data set is not really independent of the manuscript. So you won't understand the data on Zenodo without reading the manuscript. This is less of a problem in software very often, because you might have a GitHub repository with documentation, with readmes, with whatever not. So the software can also makes sense in itself. So the software availability statement needs to be there, maybe to help people find that, but it maybe doesn't need to be as detailed as the data availability ones, because people will go to the website anyway. The other thing is that the importance in the context of the manuscript is more that what was mentioned just a moment ago, the reproducibility. So how you were running that software in the context of the manuscript. That has a very high importance. So that should be the focus of the, let's call it the software reproducibility statement.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually. It's not just as simple as saying the code can be found here, like you would with the data, right? There's a whole lot more packaging to go around it. Okay. There's one more question.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, Limor.
Limor Pierre from Yale University. So we were just at the session on computational reproducibility earlier, and so it just strikes me that we're in the Research Data Alliance. Obviously, the focus is on data, but code is coming up a lot more. For the purpose of the reason that you need software to read and generate data and all of that. So I think reproducibility is a useful framework for thinking about how do we involve questions around code and software within the Research Data Alliance. And so I would just encourage, when we're doing these sort of translations from the data statements and the data citations to software and code, making those connections, that we think of it in the context of reproducibility as one of the important ones, maybe not the only ones, but those connections need to be made.
It's great thinking. I like the idea of the translation between data and code. That's nice.
Thanks so much, Lauren. It's a very complimentary work happening. I don't think my last slide has anything on it. I don't even know if I have a last slide. So we're just at the end of the session, and I want to get into the queue for special diets early because I missed it yesterday. So I think, having kind of gone through this process before in this group where we work quite collaboratively with the stakeholder community, we had some community calls between plenaries. I think the chairs did a bit of drafting and we solicited feedback. I can imagine we're getting to a point where that's something we might do next. So I think we're converging a bit on the idea that we need guidance, that we've got some ideas that maybe we'd like to lay out in a format that people could feed back on. So if you completely disagree, you can say that now. I think in developing a framework or some guidance or what we think we might be looking at here, that's the point where we can say, actually, let's not even talk about data not available. That's not in scope for this. I think we just need to kind of formulate our ideas a bit more clearly. But if you did want to participate in this work, I would really encourage you to join our interest group, which is the Policy, Standardization and Implementation IG. So you'll get our messages on any workshops that we do have. I'm going to send around a draft of that workshop report, which is pretty substantial, much more than I presented in the slides. And we would really value everyone's feedback. Like, I think we had some great perspectives in the room. It was really good to hear from all of you, and thank you for your questions and comments. So unless, Natasha, you had anything to add as co-chair, or yourself, Ian?
I think this, when we compile things, we might want to tag things where we need a bit of help, like say the vocabularies thing. That might be, can someone volunteer to do that? Or, the identifier for repositories, can someone please clarify what this is or something?
Yeah, because I think we kind of wrote up some notes from our workshop, and then we had the group who had participated review what we'd done, so people did clarify. I think Ian's probably taken some excellent notes, so hopefully we've captured the discussion. But yeah, it would be great to have people maybe spend a bit of time just reading through, making sure we captured what you said, if there was links out to resources. I think there were a few things mentioned. Great if you could add those. But other than that, thank you so much for participating. It was a really great session.
Yeah.